The mortal remains of 14 South African National Defence Force soldiers who were killed in the Democratic Republic of Congo last month will return to their families today.
Yeah, the soldiers killed in combat were part of the Southern African Development Community Mission in the Eastern DRC, and they lost their lives as the M23 rebels captured Goma.
Now, a handover ceremony is expected to take place at the Swartkop Air Force Base that is in Centurion this evening.
7 of the soldiers are from Limpopo, 3 from the Free State, and the rest are from the Northwest, Eastern Cape and the Northern Cape. To talk about this, we joined in studio now by SABC News International Editor Sophie Mokoena and SABC News' political editor Mzwandile Mbeje. So good to have all of you, well, I suppose all of us having this conversation, but to have both of you here. Thank you so very, very much for being with us this morning.
Indeed. And Sophie, perhaps to pick up, critical moment for the country, for the families as well. It's been a long, arduous 2-week wait for the return of these remains. But you know, let's just start with what this moment means today with the president, of course, who will oversee the handover of these remains.
I think the president had to, he is the commander-in-chief. He is the one who signs off in terms of deployment of troops after informing parliament. And therefore, he sent the soldiers to the DRC as part of the SADC contingent that was deployed in that country. Now, I think for many people, it would have looked very odd if the commander-in-chief was not there. And this was a major loss. Yes, let us not forget that during President Jacob Zuma's presidency, we lost soldiers in the CAR. This is the second big incident. And therefore, it is important that he must be there as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And therefore, I think the president then took a decision that immediately after his reply in parliament this afternoon, he will fly to Pretoria and then attend this ceremony. He still has to travel to Ethiopia to attend the African Union meeting, which is also important because the Peace and Security Council of the African Union will definitely look at the situation in the DRC. And with South Africa having suffered a great loss, they will have to be there. And I think this is what led to the delay today. Earlier on, the indication was the ceremony will be during lunchtime today. Then it was moved to the morning, and then it was then decided that it will be late in the evening. But I think even South Africans, most of the South Africans will be home, and they can join in mourning with the families and the relatives of those soldiers who were killed in the eastern part of the DRC. Quite a difficult moment for the country.
And even more difficult moment for the families who have now been forced to wait a little bit longer and until they're actually able to have the remains and to see, you know, what is left of them. But let's go back a little bit, Mzwai, because this has been a very contentious issue and one we saw also within the questionings that's come out of the State of the Nation address. And many saying, you know, questioning why our soldiers are there in the first place. We know that they're part of a peacekeeping mission, but there have been a lot of other allegations that have been thrown onto the table. Perhaps you want to go there. Let's talk about the SANDF's mandate, some of the rumours that have been coming out of this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shirley and Sakina and Sophie. And I think it's very interesting and important for South Africans as well to also understand our role as a country, particularly on the African continent. One of the things that really has been driving our foreign policy, particularly on the African continent, is the stability of this continent. And for the stability of this continent, so South Africa ought to play a role. I mean, for the longest time, we've been a beacon of hope in terms of assisting the conflict-ridden zones on this continent. I mean, the issue, for example, of the DRC, Leanne, doesn't really start now. It's been there for quite some time. And because it's in our interest to have a stable Africa. I mean, every time, like in the SONA, for example, when the president addresses, so he will speak about things that we need to do as a country, and then always will talk about us contributing to a better Africa. So given that we have the responsibility and we also are part of this African continent, we have an interest in its survival and its stability. So you will always have these kinds of deployments. Yes, we can ask, do they have the right equipment, properly trained, properly resourced? So those are legitimate questions that we should ask, especially if we have to undertake such mission, because it's an important mission. I mean, how many times have you had people speaking about the Inga Dam? How many times have you had people saying DRC can feed the rest of the world? But if the conditions don't allow that, and then as a country, as part of the global community, we have a role to play like they played the role when we wanted our freedom. So that is what we'll do. And of course, our foreign policy being anchored on human rights.
Mining interests, though, if I may just add that in, allegations of mining interests, and that's what they're actually doing there?
Well, okay, let's put it this way. Who deploys their resources and expect absolutely no benefits? And it doesn't have to be direct benefits. So one of the reasons why we are interested in a stable Africa, because we have mining companies here. We would like to play a role. And even if you look at where the world is going in terms of the electrification of cars and the kind of the resources that they have there. So while time and again you would have those personal interests, but in this, honestly, we've been there much longer than people would say.
But I want to stay with that, but I want to couch it slightly differently, Sophie. You invoked the Central African Republic. We had 13 soldiers who died there in 2013. Now we have 14 soldiers who died in the Eastern DRC in 2025. And the questions are being asked about South African soldiers' presence in those areas. The UN peacekeeping mission, as Mzwandile alludes to, is one that South African soldiers have been a part of. And of course now the SAMI DRC deployment. So the question is around the mandate of those soldiers in that deployment. And of course also the legal basis for the South African deployment to the Eastern DRC at this point.
Well, you are correct, Sakina. The mandate is very important. You have MONUSC under the auspice of the United Nations. South Africa has been part of MONUSC for quite a long time, since the intervention after the Sun City talks, where the facilitator was the then president of Botswana, but South Africa created facility and assisted in those Congolese dialogues, and they became part of the UN force. Then, now this one, even before this one, there was a decision at that time, some years after, to have an intervention force, because when you look at 2013, where M23 was very strong again, there was that kind of agreement that you will have an intervention force. The mandate of the UN peacekeeping was upgraded to an intervention. In other words, you really fire back, because when you are a peacekeeping, you stand between the warring factions. You don't fight side by side with any of the groups. Now, with the Southern African mission, the problem is when they are there, they were fighting side by side with the Congolese forces or the government forces. Now, these government forces, there are allegations that they are, or they have also incorporated the former Rwandan genocide, the FDLR members are part of this force. And therefore you have that murky situation that SADC has to really look at it. And therefore that is why people are arguing whether this SADC, is it a peacekeeping or an intervention force, because they've been given a mandate to fire back. And therefore, that's where the problem is. And that is why they were caught up in a standoff between M23 and the DRC forces. South Africans were not fighting the M23 when we lost these soldiers. There was a firing from the Congo forces directed at Rwanda and M23. And then there was confusion where this firing is coming from. And that led to a standoff or fighting back between the Southern African forces with the M23, backed by those other countries such as Rwanda. And therefore, that is why you have to clear this mandate. That is why you are correct when you say it's quite important to be clear in terms of the mandate, because even the soldiers who are coming back, some of them, majority, were in this contingent, the Southern African contingent force, and the others, 4 or 3, were part of MONUSC, that is the UN force. So we've been there, you can see, with blue helmets for quite a long time. Even one former South African general was once head of a UN mission in that MONUSC team that's constituted of different countries from around the world.
So let's look at this now, and we understand the complexities of a situation. And we even had the minister basically saying that if we withdraw, the International Relations and Cooperations Minister, Ronald Lamola, telling Parliament that an abrupt withdrawal of troops was even worse than a surrender. I mean, listening to the complexities of what you're saying and taking these comments into consideration, I also want to just pay attention to the troops that are left there. And we're already bringing 14 back that have lost their lives, and there have been worries and criticisms that they are ill-prepared to deal with what is going on there. It is so intense, the fighting, and it is very complex. What about helping them? What kind of support do they have, the remaining soldiers?
The challenge, I think, is that the M23 is now in control of the eastern part of the DRC, including Goma, where you have this military bases of all the forces that are assisting your MONUSC, your SAMI, DRC. And therefore, now the question becomes, if they are there now, what will be their role and their mandate?
Yeah.
Because the place has been taken over. So do they fight the M23, push them out, or what must they do now? Because the Congolese forces, some of them, have abandoned their post with the Burundian forces. So it's a very, very complex matter. And to leave also, the airport in Goma is not in use. So how do you evacuate? And lastly, you can't just leave and leave your ammunition that you brought in that country. And this is what M23 wants. They want the soldiers to leave, but they must leave the ammunition.
Yeah.
Didn't I read that we actually are deploying more soldiers to that area?
No.
Are we not going to deploy more?
I spoke to the spokesperson of the president, Vincent Mokoena, and we did ask him, our colleague did ask him in Parliament. He said there's no extra deployment, because remember, if the president is to deploy extra troops, that must go to Parliament. Yeah. That is why I find sometimes hypocritic from politicians in Parliament. They were there when the president sent a memo when these troops were leaving. Did they really read the mandate, and what did they do at that moment?
Evidently not, Mzwandile.
No, clearly. But also, I think there's a point, as she was illustrating the complexities there. I mean, if you look at the SADC EAC summit, it was quite important. And one of the things that they came out with there, because they recognized the complexity of the issue there, is that you're not just going to solve that with fighting. So there has to be negotiations. That's why they nudged the president of the DRC, Tshisekedi, to somehow have a dialogue with everyone involved, because otherwise you can send your many troops, you will not be able to resolve that. You've got to get to the crux of the problem. You know very well that President of Kagame has an interest. President of Rwanda, of Congo has an interest. Uganda has an interest. Of course, us as South Africa and SADC and ANC in general, we have an interest in what is happening there. There is an AU summit that is coming in the next few days. What are they going to speak about? It's pointless to just speak about we'll make this Africa beautiful without doing things that are tangible. Here is the problem at hand, in East Africa, where they are, by the way. So what is it that we are providing as tangible solutions as the leaders of this continent? Because when all is said and done, Sakina, Lian and Sophie, we need to see our leaders lead by example, by practically providing solutions. We did not just elect them to be there and to be ferried in nice cars and all those things. We want, because not all of us can be presidents, but someone who we have given the mandate must be able to deal with the problem. And if you and I have an issue, I can't always be running away from you. At some point, I must confront you, sit down with you, we'll resolve it.
Also, we need to wrap up very quickly, but I think it's important just to give South Africans a sense of what happens during this handing over ceremony when we receive them with the families and the president. I don't know if anybody wants to sort of tell us what to expect as the ceremony does take place later on this evening.
Well, I think what is important will be the memorial. It is a memorial. And there's an expectation that it will also include handing over the remains to the families.
Yeah.
But I think we may see changes because you still have to do certain processes in relation to issuing of documents in South Africa, because when you repatriate a body in South Africa, there are processes that must happen in the country, and that would be your pathologist, that would include your home affairs, and therefore I'm not sure whether the handing over will be ceremonial or it will be real handing over. You would recall even the remains of the fallen heroes, the ones that we saw being brought in the country. It was a ceremonial. They were taken back for processing of DNA and all of that. Because as you hand over the remains, you must be sure that you're giving these remains to the right family.
Absolutely.
That's why there was even a delay in Uganda, because when you give these remains to a country, you must be sure that these remains, really, they must go to this country.
Well, it's a tough one, and it certainly is going to be a hard one for the families, the country, the government, and that's where we ended. Thank you so much. And perhaps we could just put a picture up again of the fallen heroes. I know we have a photograph that we've been showing the whole time, but as we wrap this up, let's put a face to the conversation that we've been having.
Yeah.
And these are the fallen soldiers that are going to be handed back to their family and that have lost their lives, as we've heard, in the interest of stability on the continent. Or, you know, it's a tough one. It very, very much so is. So again, thank you very much, Sophie and Mzwandile, for talking to us about this.